Okay, so we're going to talk about contrast and exposure today. So, this is not on your notes, but I feel that it's important that I cover. So, when you look at the colors on the left, um, converting them to black and white, um, some colors will look very similar. So, this is just something that you need to keep in mind. So, like we see 4 and 7 here, when you look at them in black and white, look, they almost look identical. So this is something that you really need to pay attention to when you're photographing in color that you're later going to turn into black and white, is what colors you're including and how your camera is going to read them when you convert it to black and white. And again, that's not in the notes, but I just want to go to cover that real quick. So value in photography. Value is this graph here. It explains value to you. So value is all the colors from black to white. So from the deepest black to the perfect white and all grays in between. So if I said this photo has good value, I'm saying that that photo has a bunch of different shades of gray. It's got black, it's got white in the photo. And one reason that you want all of those tones is because we want to still see details in the whites. And if we just have like stark white, we don't get to see the detail that's going to be in the picture of the highlights and the shadows. And I don't believe that this is in your notes either, but again, it is something important. So if you want to write it down in your notes somewhere, you can. We'll be referring back to what value is in photography a lot, so don't worry. This is just the intro to it. And again, here are two images that have full tonal range where I'm able to see all the different shades of gray. I'm able to see the whites. I'm able to see the blacks. I see a bunch of different colors of black and white in both images. But I'm also still able to see the detail in the shadows here. So I can still see everything that's going on in that stuffed animal. And same with the highlights. So like on her shirt here, I'm able to still see the detail in her shirt. These two photos are good examples of images that have good value or even a good exposure, which is the first question that we're going to talk about right now. So let me go to that real quick right here. So exposure, what is exposure? Exposure is when an image, it's how an image is made in terms of light. So if I say this photo has good exposure, that means that there's still details in the highlights and there's details in the shadows. So exposure is where you get a full range of tones. Or you don't. Sometimes you can get an exposure that has really dark tones and we can't see a lot, or really light tones. But basically, it's the light in the image. How much light is being exposed to your camera? So, what does an image need to have proper exposure? This is the same kind of answer. Again, to have proper exposure, we are going to see the details in the highlights and also the details in the shadows. So for the first question, what is exposure? Exposure is how much light a photo is getting. And then the second question, what does the image need to have proper exposure? It needs to have details in the highlights and details in the shadows, with also a full range of tones in the middle. So again, we're able to see all those different shades of gray. We can see the whites. We can see the detail in the whites, that is. We can see the details in the shadows. Now, what happens if you just have middle tones and no highlights and no shadows? Well, you'll get an image similar to these two. So these are mostly middle grays. They're lacking whites and blacks, where it's just kind of muted. So I would say that these photos are giving me low contrast. So for that third question, what happens when you just have middle grays? You get images that have low contrast. They have, they're lacking whites and blacks. And they're just muted, but essentially it's just low contrast. It's also, last thing, sorry, to add to your notes, this is what we would call an underexposed image. So there's not enough light in this picture. It's underexposed. So again, what happens when you just have middle tones? You get a photo that has really low contrast, that's underexposed, that's just really muted. There's no contrast in this picture. We don't want this. We want to avoid this. But we want this. This is the correct exposure. So if you see here, we have a full range of tones from going from really dark black to white, but we can still see the detail. So see here, this is a highlight on his arm, but I can still see that he's got muscles. I can still see the definition in his muscles here. But if we go to over here, what happened to his muscles? They went away. So this is a properly exposed image because I can see all the detail in the shadows and in the highlights. Now, last question. What happens when you just have bright whites and dark black tones? So if we just have bright whites like this and dark blacks, you're going to get a really high contrast image. So high contrast image, it's also overexposed. So before these were underexposed over here, this is overexposed. Overexposed, high contrast, no detail. We're lacking detail in the shadows and in the highlights. So that should conclude the notes for the contrast and exposure slides. However, I'm going to go over a couple more pictures with you to kind of help you grasp this. So here's an example of a photo being too light. So an image loses detail in the highlights. So see here, this is too light. We're losing that detail in her shirt. And then even here, it's still too light. I'm still losing that detail. But here, this is a good exposure. I'm able to see some detail in the whites. I'm able to see those wrinkles on her shirt here and here, as opposed to here where it's all blown out. We just see white. We don't want this. We want this. And then you have the opposite, where you see an image that's too dark. So this image, way too dark. I can barely see what she's holding. And I'm not even quite sure what it is because it's so dark. I'm losing all the detail down here, losing all the detail up here. And then even here, I still think it's too dark. I can't see anything in here. I don't know what's happening. The shadows are being taken over. And then here, some would argue this would still be too dark, but I can see some detail here. So this image would be the one that you would want to pick. Now, having said that, you can break the rules. I'm giving you the rules. Once you know the rules and you know how to do them effectively, you can break them, of course. So creating an image like this one, where this picture has very high contrast. There is no gray in this picture. It's just white and black. So with this picture, this is an exception. This is an amazing photo, right? And so you can break the rules. If this photo had gray, let's say this horse was in a different background, I don't think it would be as powerful. But because the horse is completely black and the background is white, this was taken in the snow. You can see the snow on the horse's back. This is a very powerful image. So there is exceptions, but I want you to know how to do things correctly first. Okay, and that is our slides for contrast and exposure. I hope you guys learned something today that you can take away with, and you know the difference between exposure and contrast now. Again, if you have any questions, let me know, because that is what I am here for.